There is a game being played right now, a game so vast that most people will never see the board. And the pieces are not countries or armies, but currencies and debt, trillions of dollars moving through invisible channels while you sleep. While you work, while you scroll through your phone thinking the world is stable. But what if I told you that the game is already over, that the winner has been decided, and the only question left is when the losing side will realize they have been checked? What if the dollar, the currency you trust, the currency that has ruled the world for nearly 80 years, is about to face its greatest threat? Not from war, not from sanctions, but from a trap so elegant that even those who set it cannot fully control what happens when it springs shut. China has been preparing for this moment since the financial crisis of 2008, when the world watched American banks collapse and governments print money like it was paper, which it is, but we pretend it is not. They watched and they learned, and they began building something in the shadows. Something that most analysts dismissed as impossible because the conventional wisdom said that China needed the dollar more than America needed China. But conventional wisdom is often the last thing to die before empires fall. And right now, in this moment, China holds more than $3 trillion in foreign reserves, most of it in American debt. And they are not just sitting on it, they are weaponizing it, turning the very foundation of American power into a pressure point that can be squeezed whenever Beijing decides the time is right. The dollar became the world's reserve currency in when representatives from 44 nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and agreed that their currencies would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. It was a system built on trust, on the promise that America would never print more dollars than it had gold to back them, and for decades, that system worked because America was the richest nation on earth, producing half of the world's goods, holding 2/3 of the world's gold, and projecting military power across every ocean. But then came Vietnam, and the cost of that war, combined with growing social programs at home, meant that America needed to print more money, and when France, led by Charles de Gaulle, began demanding gold in exchange for their dollars in the late 1960s, President Nixon faced a choice between honoring the gold standard and bankrupting the country or breaking the promise that had held the system together. On August 15, 1971, Nixon closed the gold window, ending the convertibility of dollars to gold, and the world moved to a system of fiat currency, where money was backed not by metal but by faith, by the belief that governments would act responsibly and that the dollar would remain the safest place to store wealth. And for decades, that faith held, because even without gold, the dollar had something more powerful back in it. It had the full force of the American economy, the American military, and the global oil trade, which after 1974 was conducted almost exclusively in dollars, creating what economists call the petrodollar system. If you wanted to buy oil, you needed dollars. And if you needed dollars, you had to sell your goods to America or hold American debt, which meant that the United States could run enormous trade deficits, import far more than it exported, and simply print money to cover the difference because the rest of the world needed those dollars to function. It was the greatest free lunch in history, allowing America to live beyond its means for generations, while other countries worked and saved and accumulated dollars that they could never fully spend because spending them would mean crashing the system that gave those dollars value in the first place. But every trap needs bait. And the bait that America offered the world was security, stability, and access to the largest consumer market on earth. Countries held dollars, not just because they needed them for trade, but because American treasury bonds, backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, were considered the safest investment in the world. And when you are a central bank managing hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars in reserves, safety matters more than returns. China understood this. And after opening its economy in the late 1970s, under Deng Xiaoping, Chinese leaders made a calculated decision to link their currency, the yuan, to the dollar at a fixed rate, making Chinese goods artificially cheap for American consumers and turning their country into the world's factory. For 30 years, this arrangement worked beautifully for both sides. America got cheap goods that kept inflation low and living standards high despite stagnant wages, and China got American dollars, which they used to buy American debt, which allowed America to keep spending, which created demand for more Chinese goods, which generated more dollars, which bought more American debt, a perfect circle that seemed like it could spin forever. But then came 2008, and the circle broke. When Lehman Brothers collapsed and credit markets froze and the entire global financial system teetered on the edge of total Meltdown. Chinese leaders watched American policymakers do something that confirmed their worst fears. They watched the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department create trillions of dollars out of thin air. Not slowly over decades, but rapidly, desperately, in a matter of months. Purchasing toxic assets and bailing out banks and flooding the system with liquidity because the alternative was collapse. And China, holding more than $1 trillion in American debt at the time, realized that they were trapped. Because if they sold those bonds, they would crash the value of their own reserves. But if they held them, they were at the mercy of American monetary policy, which could devalue their holdings through inflation whenever Washington decided it was necessary. This is when Chinese President Hu Jintao gave a speech that few people in the West paid attention to, where he called for the reform of the international monetary system and the gradual establishment of a reserve currency that would be disconnected from individual nations and able to remain stable in the long run. It was a polite way of saying that China no longer trusted the dollar, and they were going to do something about it. The first move came quietly, almost invisibly, and it involved gold. While Western central banks had been selling gold for decades, treating it as a barbarous relic from a previous age, China began buying not through official channels that would alert the markets, but through private banks and proxies, accumulating thousands of tons while reporting only a fraction of their purchases to the International Monetary Fund. By 2015, when China finally updated its official gold reserves, analysts discovered that they had quietly doubled their holdings. And even then, most experts believe the real number is far higher because China has every incentive to underreport their gold reserves until the moment they are ready to use them. But gold was not enough because gold cannot be used for daily transactions in a digital world. So China launched a parallel strategy, building a global payment system called CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system designed as an alternative to SWIFT, the Western-controlled network that processes most international transactions and that America has increasingly weaponized through sanctions. Every time Washington freezes the assets of a foreign government or cuts a country off from the dollar system, it reminds the rest of the world that holding dollars means accepting American power. And China's been offering them an alternative, quietly signing currency swap agreements with dozens of countries, allowing them to trade in yuan instead of dollars, bypassing the American financial system entirely. If this is making you uncomfortable, if you are starting to see how fragile the system really is, then you are beginning to understand what most people refuse to accept. And if you want to know what happens next, if you want to understand the second and third moves before they happen, then subscribe now because what is coming will change everything you think you know about money and power. But I have to warn you, once you see this, you cannot unsee it, and you might not like what it reveals about the world we live in. The second move targets the very heart of dollar dominance, the oil market. In March of 2018, China launched the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, allowing oil futures contracts to be traded in yuan, and more importantly, making those contracts convertible to gold through exchanges in Shanghai and Hong Kong. This was not just another commodity market. This was a direct challenge to the petrodollar system because for the first time, oil exporters had a viable alternative. They could sell their oil for yuan, convert those yuan to gold if they wanted, and never touch the dollar at all. Saudi Arabia, America's closest ally in the Middle East, and the linchpin of the petrodollar system, began discussing accepting yuan for oil sales to China. And when President Xi Jinping visited Riyadh in December of 2022, he was greeted with a ceremony normally reserved for the most important heads of state, with fighter jets painting the sky and the king himself waiting to greet him. And the message was clear. The relationship between oil producers and the dollar was no longer exclusive. Russia, under Western sanctions, has already shifted much of its trade with China to yuan and rubles. And other countries, including Iran, Venezuela, and increasingly nations across Africa and Latin America are exploring ways to trade outside the dollar system because China offers them something America cannot. A chance to escape the threat of financial sanctions and the constant surveillance of their transactions. But the most dangerous move, the third move, has not fully happened yet. But the pieces are in place, and when it comes, it will be swift and devastating. China has been steadily reducing its holdings of American Treasury bonds, selling tens of billions of dollars worth each quarter while publicly denying that this represents a strategic shift. And at the same time, they have been encouraging their citizens and corporations to hold more foreign assets, to invest abroad, to move capital out of yuan and into other currencies and hard assets, preparing for the moment when the yuan will need to rise in value and the dollar will need to fall. The trap works like this. China has allowed their currency to remain relatively weak against the dollar for decades, making their exports cheap and building up enormous dollar reserves. But now they are ready to flip the script. Because a strong yuan benefits them in a world where they are no longer the low-cost manufacturer but the high-tech innovator. And more importantly, a strong yuan backed by gold and energy contracts and a vast network of trade agreements makes it a viable alternative to the dollar as a reserve currency when the moment comes. And it could be triggered by a financial crisis, a war, or simply a decision by Chinese leaders that the time is right. China will do three things simultaneously. They will announce a partial or full gold backing for the yuan. They will expand their oil for yuan program to include all major energy contracts, and they will offer massive currency swap lines to countries that agree to hold yuan reserves instead of dollars. Countries will face a choice: continue holding dollars that are being devalued by endless money printing and massive debt, or switch to a currency that offers some backing, some stability, and access to the world's largest economy without the threat of sanctions. What happens to America in this scenario is not collapse, not immediately, but something worse, a slow decline into a because when countries no longer need dollars to trade, demand for dollars falls. When demand falls, the value falls. And when the value falls, the trillions of dollars held overseas, an estimated $16 trillion in foreign hands, start flowing back to the United States as countries sell their treasury bonds and dollar reserves to buy yuan and gold and other assets. This return of dollars would be inflationary, massively inflationary, because all that money comes rushing back into the American economy at once, buying up assets, driving up prices, and making everyone holding dollars poorer by the day. The Federal Reserve would face an impossible choice: raise interest rates high enough to attract foreign capital back, which would crash the economy and make the government's debt burden unbearable, or let inflation run, which would destroy the dollar's value and wipe out the savings of millions of Americans. Either way, the standard of living that Americans have enjoyed for decades, the ability to import cheap goods and run deficits without consequences, would end. And the political and social consequences of that adjustment would tear the country apart. American policymakers know this is coming. They have wargamed these scenarios in classified meetings, and their response has been predictable and desperate. They have tried to slow China's rise through tariffs and trade wars. But tariffs only accelerate the decoupling because they give Chinese companies more incentive to sell to other markets and less dependence on American consumers. They have tried to isolate China through sanctions and export controls on advanced technology, but every sanction pushes more countries toward alternative payment systems and makes the dollar-based order look less like a system of global stability and more like a tool of American coercion. They have tried to strengthen alliances, to rebuild American manufacturing, to pass infrastructure bills and industrial policy, but none of these measures address the fundamental problem, which is that the dollar's dominance was never based on the strength of the American economy alone, but on the lack of alternatives. And now there is an alternative, and it is being built by a country with 4 times America's population, a manufacturing base that dwarfs anything the West can match, and a leadership that thinks in terms of decades and centuries rather than election cycles. You might be wondering if this is really happening, if the threat is real or just another doomsday prediction that will never come to pass, and that is exactly what those in power want you to think. That the system is too big to fail, too entrenched to change, that the dollar will remain supreme because it always has. But empires do not fall because they become weak. They fall because they become complacent, because they believe their own propaganda, because they cannot imagine a world where their power is not absolute. The British pound was the world's reserve currency for more than a century, and the transition to the dollar seemed impossible until it happened almost overnight. Because World War II destroyed Britain's economy and America emerged as the only major power with its industrial base intact, the question is not whether the dollar can be replaced. History shows us that every reserve currency eventually is. The question is what replaces it and who controls the new system. And right now, that answer is increasingly clear. And here is what terrifies those who understand how this works. China does not need to destroy the dollar to win. They just need to create enough doubt, enough uncertainty, enough alternatives that countries begin diversifying their reserves, holding fewer dollars and more yuan, more gold, more of whatever seems safe. Once that process begins, it becomes self-reinforcing, because every country that moves away from the dollar makes the dollar slightly less necessary, which encourages more countries to move away, which makes it even less necessary. And at some point, the system tips, and what was once unthinkable becomes inevitable. We are not there yet, but we are closer than most people realize. And the warning signs are everywhere for those willing to see them. Central banks are buying gold at rates not seen since the 1960s. Trade agreements are being signed that bypass the dollar. Payment systems are being built that do not touch American banks. And most ominously, America's own allies are quietly preparing for a world where the dollar is no longer the only option, because they know that Washington's willingness to weaponize the financial system means their money is never truly safe. What would you do if you knew the system was going to change? If you could see the trap closing but could not stop it? Would you try to warn people? Or would you protect yourself and let everyone else figure it out when the crisis hits? This is the dilemma facing policymakers right now, because telling the truth about the dollar's vulnerability might trigger the very crises they are trying to prevent. But saying nothing means that when the trap springs shut, nobody will be prepared for what comes next. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the system needs a crisis to force the changes that politicians cannot make on their own. Or maybe those in power genuinely believe they can manage the transition, that they can slowly move toward a multipolar currency system without chaos, without pain, without the kind of wealth destruction that accompanies every major shift in the global financial order. But history suggests otherwise, because these transitions are never smooth. They are violent and unpredictable, and they destroy the lives of ordinary people who never saw it coming and never had a chance to protect themselves. So what can you do sitting there watching this unfold, knowing that your savings are denominated in a currency that might lose half its value over the next decade, that your job might disappear as companies move production overseas, that the comfortable world you grew up in was built on a foundation that is quietly crumbling? The honest answer is that individual action can only do so much. You can own gold, you can diversify into other currencies, you can learn skills that will have value in any economy, but if the system changes, everyone is affected. And those who think they can simply opt out are fooling themselves. The only real solution is collective, political, cultural, a willingness to accept that America cannot run infinite deficits forever, that manufacturing and productive capacity matter more than financial engineering, that a country cannot remain dominant by printing money and threatening sanctions, while other nations build the industries and infrastructure of the future. But that solution requires sacrifice, requires accepting a lower standard of living in the short term to build a sustainable economy in the long term. And democracies are notoriously bad at making those kinds of choices until crisis forces their hand. If this has opened your eyes, if you are starting to see the world differently, then you need to watch what happens next, because the next episode will reveal something even more disturbing. How the central banks are preparing for a crisis that they know is coming but cannot prevent, and how the solutions they are planning might be worse than the problem itself. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and prepare yourself, because the trap is already closing, and the only question is whether you will understand what is happening before it is too late.